Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Shakti Pulse, where we glean insights from industry titans for the benefit of startup founders. I'm Liz Harrow, a partner at Shakti, and today it's our pleasure to sit down with Mercedes Chatfield-Taylor, who's a Shakti titan and also the CEO of executive search firm Artico Search. And Mercedes is the go-to search partner for venture capital and growth equity firms and their portfolio companies. So Mercedes, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, it's great to be here, Liz. Nice to see you.
Yeah, so I think a great place to start, Mercedes, would just be learning a little bit about your background. How did you get to become CEO of Artico Search and get into the search business in general?
Yeah, so I got into search in the late 90s and started off at a firm in Menlo Park, a boutique firm, and really fell in love with the idea of helping companies to scale and doing that through introductions to great talent and also to investors. And so really found myself gravitating to the investor side because they seem to have the most access to the most interesting companies. And I don't think that's changed very much. So really aligned myself early on with a couple of investors, Mayfield, Greylock, Sequoia. At the time, did a lot of work with emerging companies coming out of Israel, Palo Alto Networks, Imperva, and some others. And really that just solidified my interest in working with entrepreneurs as they scaled up their companies. In terms of my career in search, so started off with that boutique, then founded my own boutique, working with those same funds, really focusing functionally on chief marketing, chief product, some CEO work, some board work. My firm, my little firm, grew and grew and grew. We were acquired by another search firm and then ultimately acquired again by Heidrick and Struggles. And so really went from a very small boutique environment focusing only on venture-backed companies and those functional roles I talked about to getting behind the scenes at what was at the time the biggest search firm in the world. And I really enjoyed that. It taught me a lot of great lessons. It also taught me that at least from my perspective, for the client base that I wanted to work with, which were these growth companies, emerging growth companies, companies where they were still founder-led. And when we did find other leaders for these companies, even when it was a CEO, the founder was often really involved in part of the search committee to find that CEO. That required more care and feeding than the large firms were prepared to give those relatively small companies compared to their very large clients. And so ultimately stayed on board at Heidrick for 3 years and a day, which anybody who's been acquired by a company might recognize as a vesting schedule, which it was. Joined the former CEO who had first bought my search firm. He had taken over a firm called Caldwell Partners, relatively small search firm, and again went to work building up their venture capital private equity practice, did a lot of work again, CMO, CRO, CEO, board work, spanned the gamut from early stage infrastructure through to relatively big consumer brands as they grew. So Spotify, pre-IPO, companies like that. Set up Artico a little over 2 years ago, really as a reaction to the fact that while I loved Caldwell Partners, we had gone and gotten quite large. And so felt again that the structure of a public search firm where you are trying to make the quarterly results make sense and make the sort of yield per recruiter make sense didn't really equate to the kind of work that I wanted to do, which is very hands-on directly with these growth companies. So formed Artico to work specifically with early stage to growth stage companies across those functional areas. And I would say, and we haven't looked back. It's been phenomenal. It's the right size. And I would the thing I would add there is that if you are, it doesn't have to be our boutique, but if you are a growth company looking to hire and build your team and looking for a real partner, the large firms are wonderful at lots of things. They are just not the right partner typically for the smaller firms, primarily because of the way that they're structured. So you will not get the partner with the expertise that's needed to really navigate these markets. You'll get somebody much more junior who is transactional and is more affordable to them to do the business. So it makes more sense as a small company to work with other boutique organizations, including your search partners.
Right. And that's great advice, and looking forward to getting even more into that as well. But I think when we think about, or when startups think about kind of like executive search, there's sort of a default wisdom out there. And I'm sure you've heard this, Mercedes, that a lot of startup founders have, that exec firms are expensive. They, their process isn't necessarily suitable to the chaotic and fast moving startup. And typically they'll hire people from their network, for better or for worse. What's your point of view on kind of that ethos that a lot of startups have?
So I don't think they're wrong. I think that the first thing, my advice to CEOs when they're hiring their first leaders into any function is just to keep in mind, and this will determine how you find these folks. Keep in mind that anybody you hire as a functional leader into your company sets the bar for everybody else you're going to hire for as long as that person is the leader. So if you have a head of marketing or a head of product that you hire, and that person goes to build their team, they are the bar with which external talent will judge your company. It is the bar that you may not even know, if you're trying to recruit somebody, that they have decided to pass on the company if that person isn't of the caliber that they will sort of say, oh, Liz is the VP of product. I would love to work for Liz. So just know that every hire matters. And the smaller you are, the more it matters. But I do think that it's incredibly powerful to hire from network, as long as you leverage that network in a way that makes sense. Like, if you're a funded startup and you have somebody like Cable on your board from who's come out of years of investing and a career before in several growth companies, a little company called Google, he will have a network and a perspective and can help you to gauge the quality of the talent that you're looking at. So if a recommendation comes so ask your network for recommendations for anybody that you're going to hire, and then interview those network connections the same way you would anybody else. And don't settle. Just know that every single hire is setting the bar for every other hire. So your first of is arguably your most important hire at any given time.
That's great advice. And so getting into kind of like the first hires of some of the functional roles that you mentioned. So our community has startups from seed all the way to growth stage and beyond. So I understand the advice may be different for companies at any stage, but what is some of your advice to CEOs on making some of those first functional hires that you mentioned? Like whether it's sales, marketing, product, et cetera, what are kind of like some of the good, the bad, and the ugly that you've seen?
Yeah. So I'd say first and foremost is, really decide what it is. It sounds obvious, but really decide what it is that you need. There's some big themes in terms of getting it right, but first make sure you know what you want. So like, what do you want this person to do? What does first year success look like? What does second year success look like? If you can't extrapolate out to the second year, at least define what first year success looks like. And then some of those big themes, like, does their career arc make sense? Like, has the last 5 years, did they start as an IC and then move into a manager role and then move into a VP role? If you're a PLG company, is that person coming out of a HubSpot or an Atlassian or something like that, like where they've experienced that same relevant go-to-market motion, they've built through the ups and downs, they've grown as a leader, And do not hire a generalist. Like a lot of times I'll hear startup founders say, I met so-and-so and they were so smart. We really had we had to find a role and make it fit. That is not, like, a generalist is not what you need in a startup. You need somebody who has the right background from a domain perspective, from a functional perspective, is obviously going to be a great addition to the team culturally, but not a generalist. So define what it is you need. If it's deep PLG motion experience, for example, if it's scaling from one product to multi-product, if it's first institutional selling, whatever it is, define that. And then look for somebody who's done that specific journey, sold to the ICP that is your ICP, and through a period of time that you're looking to that exact journey. Another huge mistake is, I can't tell you how many PLG companies I've worked with in the last 5 years who have said, I want the Atlassian CMO. And he now has gone on to DocuSign as the president. But no, you don't want the Atlassian CMO. He is wonderful. Robert Schwani, he was their CMO, was wonderful, but he's ex-CMO of eBay North America, and then joined Atlassian when it was already at some scale, and then helped really scale it up. So unless you're a $200 million company looking to scale up, or at this stage when we're talking about him, if you're a $1 billion company or $2 billion company or 15 billion market cap company. So don't hire for something that you aspire to have in 10 years or 5 years or 4 years. Hire for, like I mentioned, that sort of, what are the first year deliverables? And do you believe that person can do it? Really good problem to have if you're hiring, say, your first head of marketing, and if you're a seed company, less than $1 million ARR, and then you scale up to 15 and you're like, wow, I'm not sure this person can actually be my head of marketing. Well, cross that bridge when you get there. You now can go out and hire a much bigger, broader marketer, and hopefully the person that you've hired that's helped you grow to 10, 15 million in ARR will want to stay on for the next leg up and will be inspired by the leader you bring on.
That's such a good point. The person you hire, it might be a different profile at every stage, and that's okay. Mercedes, are there any stories that come to mind of an experience where, it's worked out really well in terms of placement of one of those first functional hires, and then, what worked well in that experience and why was that kind of a good test case? And then an example of maybe where you were brought into a situation and it didn't work out with a company hiring for one of the first roles, and why not?
Yeah, I think when it works out extremely well is when the CEO founder is very open and transparent about what they want, and where they don't know, they ask for help. But when they know and they're sure about what they want, they can articulate it clearly. One of the things we help clients build, and most search firms will help you build, I hope, is a scorecard. So it's like a rubric, which is essentially the 4 or 5 must-haves in a role. And once the CEO agrees that those are the things that they want functionally, from a domain perspective, from a scale and scope perspective, from those first year deliverables perspective, from a culture perspective, because culture really does sort of trump everything. Then the feedback that they give you on the candidates is framed around that criteria. So rather than say, hey, Liz, I met this head of marketing and I didn't like her, it's, hey, I met this head of marketing, and while she has the PLG experience that we want, and while she's sold to the buyer that we want to sell to, she hasn't sold in a company that hasn't yet got product market fit. And I'm very worried. And so I want to add to the criteria that we have to have somebody that's done early product market fit, evangelical marketing, evangelical selling, and understands like all that's involved there. So that really direct feedback, really specific feedback, and constant feedback is a way to make sure that you're successful with any search partner. Also sharing everything. And I know that's scary, but one of the when things are taken out of context, it's really hard to understand. And so if we aren't told that there's a board member that has a different perspective, or there's somebody else on the team with a different perspective who has a yes, no vote, one of the things I ask my CEOs is, hey, if there's somebody with a yes, no vote, can we have them on at least the initial calibration conversations around these candidates, around the criteria, around the success factors? So we have all of those things. It usually goes really, really well. When we don't, it's really a recipe for problems.
Thank you. And do any specific examples come to mind of a situation where it didn't work out, or a company, they just weren't ready necessarily for to be partnered with the executive search, or had to change their own tactic in terms of how they went about the process?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, it just comes back to that information loop. Like we really want to be, and any good search person wants to be, a great partner. And so really calibrating and understanding the feedback, understanding what success factors that we're looking for, understanding. I'd say the other thing is, so there's some real big gotchas to avoid. So compensation, have the conversation early on. Like if your compensation range for your first head of product is not at market, or you expect that this person is going to, take all cash and no equity, make sure that you align with both your investors on what they're seeing on comp and your search firm around what they're seeing on comp. Agree to the comp in the beginning, and then really don't change it too much. Like I see a lot of clients make mistakes around underpaying and overpaying. Like people will ask for all sorts of things, but you want to be, the 50th to 75th percentile for cash compensation. You don't want to overpay on cash if you're an early stage company. Obviously, in this environment, it's incredibly important, but in any environment, like if you're hiring somebody that's that focused on cash and short-term cash, I don't know if you saw the Carta data that came out recently that basically talked about only 8% of all startup hires ever make it to the 4-year vesting period. That is atrocious, horrible. And part of that would be just misalignment around motivation and making sure that, making sure you understand what's important to people on every level, compensation, what they want out of their career, what they want out of the role, and don't force a fit. Make sure that there's alignment there early on and often.
Yeah, wow, that is a shocking stat.
Oh, it's terrible. It's terrible.
So Mercedes, I think all companies at the stage that you deal with are thinking about kind of board of directors and members and maybe making that first hire. Is that something that you help companies with or advise them on? And if so, what advice do you have for selecting their first outside board member?
Yeah. The board is really interesting. So most of the time we get retained to find board members for companies that are getting ready for some type of liquidity event. So they're at the stage where they're thinking about the public markets. They want to make sure that they have a very diverse board for compliance reasons, best practices reasons, and also just, best outcomes. I would say that it's not too early to start thinking about the composition of your board, even as you get into market with your initial offerings and way before you're thinking about an IPO. And I think the first thing to think about is, who are your investors? Who are your board members today? Do you have board members? Several funds have, investors who have been operators and have been operators recently. So you will have entrepreneurs on your board who have been in the CEO or operating suite before. I mean, I am thinking of recently we worked on a CEO project where both the investor from Andreessen Horowitz and the investor from the other fund, small fund, had been CEOs in the past. So if you already have operators on your board, you have the luxury of waiting a little while. But if you don't, think about what voice is missing around the table. So what is it, as you as a founder, let's say your expertise is in product and technology. Let's say your investors also have some expertise in product and technology, or they're financially oriented. If that's the case, then maybe voice of the customer is missing. Maybe voice of global brand is missing. Maybe you want somebody with some marketing chops. If you're a PLG kind of company, maybe you want somebody who, was in the run-up of Slack's huge success, either as the head of product or the head of marketing, probably not the CEO. But that kind of a board composition conversation is really important. And then be really clear about what you want from that board member. Do you want a mentor as a CEO? I think it's a great idea for a CEO founder if they don't have those investors on their board. And even when they do, who have been CEOs and successful CEOs, to get those board members involved early and on your board so you can have those conversations like, hey, what did you do when this happened and how did you do it? And that voice is really, really important. So I would say definitely think about the board as, and by the way, don't hire a huge advisory board. Like I see a lot of these small companies say, oh yeah, I'm going to put this person on as an advisor. And then what do you really get from that relationship? And what do they really get from that relationship? And so go ahead and hire a real board member who's going to be involved between board meetings, who's going to help coach you on what's important to you in the business, who adds value, and who is appropriate for your business.
Right. So Mercedes, when and how should startups engage with an executive search firm or someone like you, in terms of, what's the right stage? What's the best way to go about it? Just any advice for kind of getting started if companies have never worked with an executive search firm?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, talk to your board, talk to your investors. I'm amazed. Sometimes CEOs will have phenomenal investors, and I will have met them at some time in the past, and they will call me and ask me for something, and I'll say, hey, have you asked your board member yet, your investor? And they've said, no, I haven't yet. And I'm flattered that they've called me, but I also think like, wow, like they've taken on this capital. These firms have these wonderful platforms and services. So go ahead and call on those folks. So I would say I love the direct calls, incoming calls to take on, a CMO project, a CRO project, whatever. But ask your board who they've worked with successfully. Also look for product market fit. That is a huge thing. Like look to the firm, get some recommendations for different firms, talk to 2 or 3 firms, establish who you have the best chemistry with, and then ask them for 5 or 6 recent relevant searches that they did themselves, not the firm did, not the, when I was at Heidrick, we could get a laundry list of pretty much any kind of search because we did so much work, right, as a firm. But if you didn't touch that work, it was never really going to come into play for, company XYZ. So ask your board, ask your fellow CEOs for recommendations. Ask the firm that you're talking to for recent and relevant work that they would recommend you highlight or they highlight, and then call references. I mean, it's the same thing on hiring. Like when you hire somebody, call at least 5 references yourself. Like don't farm out the references. When you hire a search firm, call 3 to 5 of their references and make sure that you're comfortable with them. Once you do that, then you never have to do that again. Hopefully you have a long relationship. I don't like to be transactional. I like to work with the same clients over and over and over again, and I do. And most search firms are that way. So ask your network, trust and verify with a specific partner. Make sure you know that they're going to be doing your work. Make sure you know what work they've done recently and relevantly. And then call the CEOs that they mentioned by name that they did that work, and make sure that they had the kind of experience that you're looking to have, because not everybody has the same expectation or outcomes.
Mm-hmm. That's really helpful. And I guess lastly, just in terms of timing is, when's the right time for someone to go through this process? Is it a certain revenue marker or fundraising marker, or what should they be looking for that says, okay, this now is the time where I need to start formalizing this process and working with someone like you?
I think you should. It should be a critical hire that you need to get right. Right. It should be a critical hire. It should be a hire where you know that your personal network isn't going to glean a broad enough sample of talent for you to get the optimal outcome. So if you are looking for your first head of product, and you've never hired a head of product, and you don't come from a company that has a huge history of producing incredible product leaders. Same thing, if you don't come from a company that has a huge sales culture and a tangible sales culture, and you're looking to hire a sales leader, if it's outside your area of expertise, outside your network, and it's a critical hire, you probably should think about hiring a search firm.
Great. Well, Mercedes, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insights on hiring some of those first kind of functional hires. You've been an amazing partner to us at Shakti and to our companies as well. So thank you for sitting down and spending some time with us.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Really nice to see you, Liz.